The library smelled of deteriorating paper and forgotten promises, which was exactly how Alara preferred it. While the rest of Blood Moon Pack gathered in the Great Hall for the arrival of Alpha King Theron, she remained surrounded by stacks of medical journals from the 1800s, cross-referencing symptoms of what the ancients called moon sickness with modern autoimmune disorders. The other Omegas had spent weeks preparing for this moment, hoping to catch the eye of the most powerful werewolf in the Northern Territories. But Alara had more important concerns than some overgrown alpha's mating instincts. 3 Omegas had died in the past 6 months across different packs, all exhibiting the same progressive weakness, all dismissed by pack doctors as simple failure to thrive. Alara knew better. There was a pattern here, a biological mechanism that everyone else was too invested in supernatural explanations to see. She heard the commotion from the Great Hall, even through the thick stone walls of the library archives. The unmistakable sound of several hundred wolves dropping to one knee in submission, the ritual greeting for an Alpha King. Alara didn't look up from her microscope where she was examining a blood sample from one of the sick Omegas, carefully noting how the cells seemed to cannibalize themselves in a way that suggested not disease but systematic poisoning. If she could just isolate the compound, identify the delivery mechanism, she could prove that this wasn't some mystical Omega weakness, but deliberate harm. Someone was killing Omegas and making it look natural, and she was close to proving it. The library door crashed open with enough force to rattle the ancient shelves. Alara's hand jerked, ruining the slide she'd spent 3 hours preparing. She spun around, a sharp reprimand on her lips, and found herself staring at a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite in fury. He was easily 6.5 feet tall, with black hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes that shifted between human gray and wolf gold. He wore the formal regalia of the Alpha King, all black leather and silver clasps, and he was staring at her with an expression of such stunned intensity that she instinctively stepped back. "You," he breathed, and the single word carried the weight of revelation and disaster combined. Behind him, Alara could see her pack's Alpha, Marcus, and his daughter Vivienne, both looking confused and increasingly horrified. The scent hit her then, overwhelming and unmistakable, even to her wolf-deaf senses. Pine and thunderstorms, and something wild that made her hindbrain scream danger and mine in equal measure. Oh no. Oh, absolutely not. This could not be happening. Theron crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, and Alara found herself backed against her research table, glass slides digging into her spine. Up close, he was even more overwhelming, radiating power that made the air feel thick. "I've searched for you for 10 years, he said, his voice rough with emotion. 10 years, and you've been here, in this forgotten corner, this whole time." His hand came up as if to touch her face, and Alara ducked under his arm, putting the table between them. Her heart was pounding, but not with excitement, with the cold clarity of dread. She knew exactly what this was. She'd read every study, every ancient text, every biological explanation. The so-called mating bond was nothing more than a complex pheromone, response designed to ensure genetic diversity. It was chemistry, not destiny. It was biology, not fate, and she wanted absolutely no part of it. "I'm not interested," she said flatly, proud that her voice didn't shake. "Whatever you're feeling is just a hormonal response to compatible genetic markers. It will fade in a few weeks if you don't reinforce the neural pathways by engaging with the stimulus." She saw his expression shift from wonder to confusion to something that looked like pain. Good. Maybe if she was clinical enough, he'd leave her alone. "I have important work to do, work that actually saves lives, and I don't have time for biological imperatives masquerading as romance." The silence that followed was deafening. Alpha Marcus made a strangled sound. Vivienne looked like she might faint, or possibly combust from secondhand embarrassment. The other wolves who had followed the Alpha King to witness his moment of romantic destiny were frozen in various states of shock. No one, in the entire history of werewolf kind, rejected their mate. It simply wasn't done. The bond was sacred, inevitable, the one force that even the most dominant alpha submitted to. But Alara had never been good at following rules she found illogical, and she certainly wasn't going to start now. Theron's face had gone very still, that dangerous stillness that predators got before they struck. "You're refusing the mate bond," he said slowly, as if testing the words to see if they made sense. "You're refusing me." It wasn't a question, but Alara answered anyway. "Yes. Emphatically yes. I don't know you. I don't want to know you. And I'm not going to derail my entire life because our biology is compatible. Now, if you'll excuse me, you've just destroyed 3 hours of work, and I need to prepare another slide." She turned back to her microscope with pointed dismissal, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for a new glass slide. She could feel his presence like a physical weight, could sense the leashed power and confusion and hurt radiating from him. Part of her, the small part that was still connected to her Omega instincts, wanted to soothe him. The rest of her, the part that had spent her whole life being called broken and defective, refused to become what everyone expected. She heard him leave, his footsteps heavy on the stone floor, heard the frantic whispered conversation that followed in the hallway, heard Alpha Marcus trying to explain that she was an aberration, Omega who couldn't shift, couldn't connect to her wolf, practically human in her stubborn rationality, heard Vivian offering herself as a more suitable match, reminding the Alpha King that she was a trained warrior, a proper wolf, someone who understood pack dynamics and hierarchy. Alara forced herself to focus on her work, pipetting carefully measured drops of reagent onto the slide. Her hands had stopped shaking. She'd done the right thing, the logical thing, the safe thing. She absolutely had not just made a catastrophic mistake that would haunt her for the rest of her potentially very short life. If you're enjoying this story of science versus destiny and a love that refuses to follow the rules, make sure to hit that like button and drop a comment telling me whether you think Alara made the right choice. And subscribe, because this is just the beginning of a romance that will challenge everything you thought you knew about fate and free will. The Alpha King stayed at Blood Moon Pack for 3 days, and Alara successfully avoided him for exactly 2.5 of them. She'd perfected the art of invisibility over the years, knowing which corridors were least traveled, which hours the training grounds were empty, how to move through the pack house like a ghost. But on the afternoon of the 3rd day, she returned to her small room in the Omega Wing to find him sitting on her bed, looking at the walls covered in charts and research papers and medical diagrams, with an expression of fascinated bewilderment. "This is incredibly illegal," she informed him, not bothering to hide her annoyance. "Breaking and entering, invasion of privacy, probable violation of several territorial laws." He looked up at her, and she was struck again by how his eyes shifted between human and wolf, as if he was having trouble controlling the transformation. "I needed to understand," he said simply. "Needed to understand who you are. Why you would refuse something that most wolves would kill for." He gestured at her walls, at the decades of collected research, the carefully documented case studies, the hand-drawn maps showing the geographic distribution of Omega deaths. "You're trying to prove that Omega weakness is manufactured," he said, and there was something like respect in his voice. "That the vulnerability we've always attributed to Omega biology is actually systematic poisoning spanning decades." Alara felt her defensive walls crack slightly. No one had ever looked at her work and understood it immediately. Most wolves dismissed her research as the obsessive ravings of a broken Omega trying to find meaning in her defectiveness. "Someone is killing us," she said quietly, slowly, carefully, in ways that look natural. And everyone is so invested in the narrative of fragile Omegas needing alpha protection that they can't see the pattern. Theron stood, moving to examine the map more closely. "Show me," he said. So she did. She walked him through 5 years of research, explaining how she'd connected cases across 12 different packs, how the symptoms always followed the same progression, how the deaths were always attributed to natural Omega fragility. She showed him the blood work that suggested heavy metal poisoning, specifically a compound that targeted the same biological pathways that allowed wolves to shift. She explained her theory that someone was deliberately weakening Omegas to maintain the power structure that benefited Alphas and the existing hierarchy. And as she talked, she forgot to be defensive, forgot to maintain her walls, forgot everything except the fierce joy of having someone actually listen. "This is brilliant," Theron said when she finished, and the admiration in his voice was so genuine it made her chest hurt, and absolutely terrifying. "If you're right, if someone is doing this deliberately, then every Omega in every pack is at risk." He turned to face her fully. "I can help you. I have resources, access to records from every pack in the Northern Territories, the authority to demand blood samples and medical histories. Let me help you prove this." Alara wanted to say yes, wanted it with an intensity that alarmed her. But she'd learned the hard way that accepting help from alphas always came with strings, always came with expectations of gratitude and submission and the surrender of autonomy. "Why?" she asked bluntly. "Why would you help me? Because of some biological imperative you can't control?" His expression went very soft and also very sad. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said quietly. "Because Omegas are dying, and someone needs to care enough to find out why. Because you've been fighting this battle alone for years and you deserve support." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "And yes, because you're my mate. And even if you reject everything that means, I still want to see you safe and happy and achieving the things that matter to you." It was perhaps the most perfect thing he could have said, which made it also the most dangerous. Alara felt her resolve wavering, felt the treacherous pull of connection and understanding. "I work alone," she said, but it came out less firm than she intended. "I don't need an alpha protector or a mate or anything except access to better laboratory equipment." "Then I'll get you better laboratory equipment," Theron said immediately. "No strings, no expectations, no demands for gratitude or submission. Just resources for research that could save hundreds of lives." He moved toward the door, then paused. "I'm returning to the capital tomorrow. The offer stands, whenever you're ready. Send word and I'll send you anything you need." He left before she could respond, closing the door quietly behind him. Alara stood in her small room surrounded by years of research and felt the walls she'd built around herself beginning to crack. This was dangerous. This was how they got you. You started accepting help, started trusting, started believing that maybe this alpha was different, and then they owned you. She should refuse. She should maintain her boundaries. She should protect herself the way she always had. But 3 more Omegas had gotten sick in the past month, and she was running out of time to find the cure before more of them died. The equipment arrived 2 weeks later. Not just any equipment, but the kind of advanced analytical tools that major research universities fought over. Mass spectrometer, gene sequencer, high-resolution microscope, centrifuge, and enough reagents and supplies to run tests for years. The delivery wolves said it came from the Alpha King's personal funds. No pack contribution required. There was a note in bold, angular handwriting that simply said, "For saving lives. No strings attached. T." Alara stood in her transformed laboratory space, formerly a dusty storage room that had been cleaned and renovated overnight, and felt something in her chest that she refused to name. This changed everything. With this equipment, she could run tests that had been impossible before, could track the poison to its source, could finally prove what she'd suspected for years. And he'd given it to her with no demands, no expectations, nothing except apparent genuine desire to help her succeed. She told herself that accepting the equipment didn't mean anything. Told herself she was just being practical, using available resources to achieve important goals. Told herself that Theron was probably just trying to win her over with expensive gifts, that this was just a more sophisticated form of manipulation. She told herself a lot of things over the following months as she worked 18-hour days, as breakthroughs came one after another, as the evidence mounted into an undeniable case. She told herself she wasn't thinking about him at all. She was lying, of course, but she was very good at lying to herself by that point. The truth was that she thought about him constantly, thought about the way he'd looked at her research with respect instead of dismissal, thought about how he'd offered help without demanding submission, thought about the note that had said for saving lives like her work mattered more than any mate bond. It was confusing and irritating, and she resented how much space he took up in her mind when she had important work to do. The breakthrough came 4 months after Theron had left. Alara finally isolated the compound, a derivative of wolfsbane that had been chemically modified to be slower acting and harder to detect. But it was the delivery mechanism that turned her blood cold. The poison was being added to the supplements that omegas were required to take, the ones that pack doctors prescribed to help with heat cycles and fertility. Someone with access to medical supplies across multiple packs was systematically poisoning omegas under the guise of healthcare. And when she traced the supply, chain back, every single shipment originated from the same source: the Council of Elders, the governing body that oversaw all pack law and tradition across the territories. The same council that had spent centuries reinforcing the narrative of omega fragility and alpha dominance. The same council that benefited from keeping omegas weak and dependent. Alara stared at her research, at the undeniable proof of systematic murder, and realized she was in serious danger. If the council found out what she knew, they would kill her and destroy all evidence. She needed to get this information to someone with enough power to challenge the council, someone who wouldn't be cowed by tradition or threatened into silence. She needed the Alpha King. She'd been so careful not to need him, not to depend on him, not to give in to the bond she still insisted was just biology. But now she had no choice. She packed her research into waterproof bags, made copies of everything, and hid them in 3 separate locations, and sent a message to the capital. 3 words: "I need you." He arrived before dawn the next morning, moving with such speed that he must have shifted and run through the night the moment he received her message. He found her in the laboratory, surrounded by evidence and exhaustion, and the relief on his face when he saw her safe was almost painful to witness. "Show me everything," he said, and his voice carried the cold fury of an alpha ready for war. She walked him through the evidence, watching as his expression shifted from shock to rage to grim determination. When she showed him the supply chain documentation proving council involvement, his eyes went completely gold, and she felt the temperature in the room drop as his power leaked out. "They've been murdering omegas for decades," he said, each word precise and lethal, systematically weakening an entire classification to maintain political control. He looked at her with something like awe. "You proved it. You proved something that every wolf in every pack has accepted as natural law for generations. You changed everything. I need your help getting this information public," Alara said, trying to stay focused on the practical aspects. "The council controls most media, most communication channels. They'll suppress this if they can. I need someone with enough authority that they can't silence you. Someone who can force a formal investigation." Theron nodded slowly. "I can do that. I can call a summit. Require attendance from every Alpha and Council member. Present the evidence publicly, in a way they can't deny or cover up." He moved closer, his hand coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that contradicted his earlier fury. "But Alara, the moment this goes public, you become a target. The council won't take this exposure lying down. They'll try to discredit you, silence you, possibly kill you. Let me protect you. Please." This was it. The moment she'd been avoiding for months. The moment where she either maintained her independence and probably died for it, or accepted help and all the complicated feelings that came with it. Alara had spent her entire life refusing to be the weak omega that everyone expected, had built her identity around logic and self-sufficiency, and the rejection of pack dynamics that relegated her to the bottom of every hierarchy. But standing here, looking into Theron's eyes, and seeing genuine care and respect alongside the bond neither of them had chosen, she realized that maybe accepting help wasn't the same as accepting weakness. Maybe letting someone stand with you wasn't the same as letting them control you. Maybe she'd been so afraid of becoming what others expected that she'd stopped herself from becoming everything she could be. "Okay," she said quietly, and watched relief transform his face. "Okay, I'll accept your protection. But Theron, I need you to understand something. I'm still not ready for the mate bond. I'm still not ready to be what you might want or need. I'm just agreeing to let you help keep me alive long enough to see this through." She expected disappointment, maybe frustration, Instead, he smiled, small and genuine, and somehow sad. "I'll take what you can give," he said softly, "and I'll wait for the rest, however long it takes, because you're worth waiting for, Alara. Not because of some bond neither of us chose, but because of who you are, the woman who spent years fighting alone for justice no one else even saw, the scientist who values truth over tradition, the Omega who refused to be what everyone expected. You're extraordinary, and I'll wait as long as you need." It was too much. Too honest. Too vulnerable. Too close to the feelings she'd been suppressing. Alara pulled away, busying herself with organizing her research papers. "We should leave soon," she said, not quite looking at him. "Before the council realizes what I've discovered." He let her retreat, let her hide behind practicality. "I have wolves waiting outside. We'll travel under heavy guard, and I'm taking you directly to the capital where I can keep you safe." As they prepared to leave, as she packed years of work into travel bags, Alara tried not to think about how it felt to finally have someone on her side. Tried not to notice how Theron moved around her with careful respect for her space. Tried not to acknowledge the growing warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with choice. She was still not ready to call it love, but maybe, possibly, she was ready to call it something. Make sure to comment below about what you think will happen when the council discovers what Alara has found, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part where everything Alara thinks she knows gets turned upside down. The summit was set for the full moon, 6 weeks away. 6 weeks for the council to discover what Alara knew. 6 weeks for them to prepare their defense or plan their attack. 6 weeks that Theron used to keep her locked in the palace like a precious artifact, surrounded by guards and protocol and luxury that made her want to climb the walls. She appreciated the protection in theory, but in practice it felt like a gilded cage. She wasn't allowed to leave the palace grounds, wasn't allowed to contact anyone from her old pack, wasn't allowed to do anything except wait and refine her presentation and slowly go insane from inactivity. Theron was gone most days, handling his duties as Alpha King, meeting with allies, preparing the political groundwork for the summit. When he was present, he was unfailingly courteous, checking on her needs, offering her access to anything she wanted except freedom. It was during one of his absences that Alara discovered the palace library, a massive collection that made her old workspace look like a closet. She was exploring the medical section, looking for historical precedent for council corruption, when she found the restricted archives hidden behind a false wall. The books there were ancient, leather covers crumbling, pages written in old dialects that took her hours to translate. But what she found made her blood run cold. Records of a ritual, used by alphas in centuries past, that could sever and erase the mate bond. Not just reject it, but completely remove it from existence, erasing the rejected mate's memory of the alpha entirely. The ritual was marked as forbidden, dangerous, with warnings about unintended consequences written in increasingly frantic handwriting by various scholars over the years. She was still reading when Theron found her that evening. He took one look at the open books, at her expression, and went very still. "Alara," he started, but she cut him off. "Why do you have detailed instructions for a memory-erasing ritual in your private archives?" Her voice was remarkably calm considering her hands were shaking. Why would the Alpha King need to know how to make someone forget he exists? She watched emotions flicker across his face. Guilt, fear, desperate hope, resignation. "I was researching options," he admitted finally. "After you rejected me, I was angry and hurt, and the council was pressuring me to choose a politically advantageous mate. They suggested the ritual as a solution, said it would free us both from an unwanted bond, but you didn't use it." Alara said slowly, trying to understand. "You're still here, still obviously affected by the bond." Theron moved closer, his expression anguished. "I couldn't. Even researching it felt like a betrayal of everything the bond means. And more than that, I realized I didn't want to forget you. Didn't want you to forget me, even if you never accepted the mate bond, even if we never had anything more than what we have now." I wanted to keep the possibility, the hope. He reached for her hand, and this time she let him take it. I would never use that ritual, Alara. Never force you to forget me or manipulate your memories. I know you value your mind, your autonomy, above everything else. I would never violate that. She wanted to believe him. Standing there in the dusty archives, his hand warm around hers, she wanted to believe that he was different from every other alpha who had tried to control her. But the existence of that research, the fact that he'd even considered it, planted a seed of doubt that she couldn't quite dislodge. "Promise me," she said quietly. "Promise me that no matter what happens, no matter how angry or hurt you get, you'll never use that ritual. You'll never take my memories or my choices." His grip tightened, almost painfully. "I swear it," he said, and there was power in the words. The kind of binding oath that alphas used for the most serious promises. "I swear on my life, on my pack, on everything I am, that I will never violate your mind or your memories. Your choices are your own, always." It should have been enough. The oath should have settled her fears, but Alara had learned long ago that people could break even the most sacred promises when circumstances pushed them hard enough. She carefully closed the ancient books, filing away the information for later, just in case. "The summit is in 4 weeks, she said, changing the subject. "I want to practice my presentation. Make sure the evidence is airtight and undeniable." Theron nodded, clearly relieved to move past the uncomfortable moment. "I've invited several human scientists and medical professionals to attend, people outside the pack structure who can verify your findings independently. The council won't be able to dismiss this as omega hysteria or fabricated evidence." The next 4 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Alara refined her presentation until she could deliver it in her sleep. Theron brought in expert after expert to review her findings, and every single one confirmed what she'd discovered. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, damning. The council had been systematically murdering omegas for over 50 years, using modified wolfsbane in mandatory supplements to keep omegas weak and dependent. The estimated death toll was in the thousands. It was genocide, carried out slowly and carefully under the guise of healthcare. By the time the full moon arrived, Alara was as ready as she would ever be. She stood in her borrowed rooms, dressed in formal clothes that Theron had provided, and tried to calm her racing heart. Today, she would stand before every alpha and council member in the territories and prove that everything they believed about omega fragility was a lie. Today, she would give voice to thousands of dead omegas who had been dismissed as too weak to survive. Today, she would change the world, or die trying. Theron came to escort her to the summit hall, and he looked magnificent in full royal regalia, every inch the commanding Alpha King. But his eyes were soft when he looked at her, and his hand was gentle when he offered it. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I can present the evidence myself. You don't have to put yourself in their line of fire." Alara took his hand, drawing strength from the contact even as she maintained her independence. "Yes, I do," she said firmly. "They need to see that an omega discovered this. They need to see that we're not weak or stupid or incapable of complex thought. They need to see me standing there, alive and strong and undeniable, proving everything they believe is wrong." The summit hall was packed with hundreds of wolves, all the major alphas and their seconds, council members in their ceremonial robes, witnesses from dozens of packs. The air was thick with power and tension, and the expectant hush of history about to be made. Alara walked to the central platform with Theron at her side, and she could feel every eye in the room on her, could hear the whispers. "That's her? That's the defective omega? She can't even shift. What could she possibly have to say?" Let them whisper. Let them doubt. She was about to prove them all catastrophically wrong. Theron addressed the assembly first, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an Alpha King. "I have called this summit to present evidence of crimes against Omega kind that span decades and implicate the highest levels of our governance. What you are about to hear will challenge everything you believe about pack hierarchy and Omega biology. I ask that you listen with open minds and remember that truth matters more than tradition." Then he stepped aside, and Alara began to speak. She presented her evidence methodically, walking them through 5 years of research, showing blood work and chemical analysis and supply chain documentation. She explained how the modified wolfsbane worked, how it targeted the biological pathways that allowed shifting, how it was designed to be slow-acting and difficult to detect. She showed them the death toll, pack by pack, year by year, an undeniable pattern of suffering. And she showed them how every single poisoned supplement came from council-approved suppliers, how the distribution was controlled by council-appointed pack doctors, how the entire system was designed to keep omegas weak while appearing to care for their health. The silence when she finished was absolute. Then one of the council elders stood, his face purple with rage. "This is absurd," he sputtered. "Fabricated evidence from a delusional omega with, delusions of competence. She cannot even access her wolf. How can we trust anything from someone so fundamentally broken?" Alara had expected this, had prepared for it. "You're right that I cannot shift," she said calmly. "Would you like to know why?" She pulled out one final piece of evidence, her own blood work from 5 years ago, before she'd stopped taking the supplements. "Because I was being poisoned too. Because my inability to shift isn't a birth defect. It's the result of years of consuming the same modified wolfsbane that killed thousands of others. I stopped taking the supplements 5 years ago, and my recent blood work shows my shifting pathways beginning to heal. In another year, maybe 2, I'll likely be able to shift for the first time in my life." The hall erupted into chaos. Alphas shouting questions, council members trying to shout over them, omegas in the audience crying as they realized their weakness had been manufactured. Theron's power crashed over the room, like a wave, forcing silence through sheer dominant will. "The evidence will be made available to independent investigators," he announced. "Every pack doctor will be required to submit their supplement supplies for testing. Every omega who wishes it will receive detoxification treatment and monitoring, and the council members responsible for this will face justice." The head of the council, Elder Matthias, stood slowly. He was ancient, one of the oldest living werewolves, and his power was legendary. "You would break the council over the word of one broken omega?" His voice was soft, dangerous. "You would overturn centuries of tradition based on accusations from someone who understands nothing of what it takes to maintain order among our kind?" "I would seek truth over tradition," Theron replied, his voice equally soft and infinitely more dangerous. "I would choose justice over comfort. And I would stand with the Omega, who spent years fighting alone for answers while the rest of us accepted murder as natural law." Matthias smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "So be it. But know this, Alpha King. By championing this Omega, by accepting a mate so fundamentally unsuitable, you have made enemies of forces far older and more powerful than you can imagine. The Council has maintained order for 500 years. We will not fall, because one young Alpha has become besotted with an aberration." The threat was clear, and Alara felt Theron's power spike in response. This was it, the moment where everything changed. The Council would either submit to investigation, or they would fight. And if they fought, it would tear the territories apart. She'd known this confrontation was coming, had prepared herself for the consequences. But standing there, feeling the weight of centuries of tradition and corruption arrayed against them, she realized just how dangerous this fight would be. The summit dissolved into tense negotiations and shouted arguments that lasted into the night. By the time Theron brought her back to the palace, Alara was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. She'd done it. She'd presented the evidence, made the accusations public, started the process that would hopefully bring justice for thousands of murdered Omegas. But she'd also made herself a target for forces that would stop at nothing to maintain their power. "You were magnificent today," Theron said as they reached her rooms. "Brilliant and brave and absolutely unstoppable." He looked at her with such open admiration that it made her chest ache. "I am in awe of you, Alara. Not because you're my mate, but because you're you. Because you saw injustice and refused to look away. Because you fought when anyone else would have accepted the easy lie. She should thank him and go inside. Should maintain the professional distance she'd worked so hard to preserve. Instead, she found herself leaning into him, accepting the comfort of his solid presence. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "The council won't let this go. They'll come for me, for you, for anyone who threatens their power." Theron's arms came around her carefully, leaving her space to pull away if she wanted. "I know," he said into her hair. "But you're not alone anymore. You have me, you have my pack, you have every Omega who now knows the truth. We'll face whatever comes together." It felt too good, being held by him. Too safe, too right, too close to surrender. Pulled back, needing distance to think clearly. "I should rest," she said. "Tomorrow we start the formal investigation." He let her go immediately. No pressure, no demands. "Sleep well, Alara. I'll have guards outside your door." As she prepared for bed, alone in her luxurious rooms, Alara tried not to think about how it had felt to be held by him, tried not to acknowledge how much she'd wanted to stay in his arms, tried not to admit that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to feel something that went beyond biology and into dangerous territory like actual emotion. She was still not ready to call it love, but she was running out of other names for this growing warmth in her chest every time she saw him. If you're as invested in this story as I am, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next when the council makes their move, and Alara discovers that some promises are easier to make than keep. The attack came 3 days after the summit. Alara was working in the Yao laboratory that Theron had set up for her in the palace, analyzing blood samples from Omegas who had volunteered for the detoxification study when the first explosion rocked the building. She had enough time to grab her most critical research before the second blast took out the outer wall, and then she was running through smoke and falling rubble with alarms screaming and wolves howling in rage and pain. She made it to the corridor before someone grabbed her from behind. A hand clamped over her mouth, an arm like iron around her waist. She fought, using every self-defense technique she'd learned over years of being the weakest member of her pack, but her attacker was far stronger. She was dragged backwards through a service passage she hadn't known existed, away from the sounds of fighting, into the dark belly of the palace. When the hand finally released her, she spun to find herself facing Elder Matthias and 2 other council members. They were in what looked like ancient catacombs beneath the palace, stone walls covered in old pack symbols and the musty smell of centuries. "You have caused us considerable trouble, little Omega," Matthias said conversationally, as if they were discussing weather rather than kidnapping and attempted murder. "We had hoped the Alpha King would see reason once his initial infatuation faded. We had hoped you could be managed quietly, but you have proven surprisingly resilient." Alara forced herself to stay calm, to think through her fear. "Killing me won't make the evidence disappear," she said. "It's already public, already verified by independent scientists. Murdering me will just prove everything I've accused you of." Matthias smiled. That same unpleasant expression from the summit. "Oh, we're not going to kill you, my dear. That would be far too obvious. No, we have something much more elegant planned." He nodded to the other council members, who began setting up what looked like a ritual circle, marking symbols on the stone floor with something that glowed faintly silver. Alara's blood went cold as she recognized the configuration. She'd seen these exact symbols in the forbidden books in Theron's archive. The memory erasure ritual. "You're going to make me forget," she whispered, and hated how her voice shook. Matthias nodded approvingly. "Very good. Yes, we're going to erase your memories of the past 5 years. Your research, your discoveries, your accusations against the council. All of it. Gone as if it never existed. You'll wake up as the broken little Omega you were before you started causing trouble. And we'll place you somewhere far from here, where you can live out your limited days in peace." He moved closer, and Alara stumbled back until she hit the wall. The beauty of this ritual is that it's irreversible. Once your memories are gone, they're gone forever. And as a bonus, it will sever your connection to the Alpha King. He'll forget you too, eventually, once the mate bond is completely erased. Everyone wins. Theron will know what you've done, Alara said desperately. He'll investigate. He'll figure it out. Matthias laughed. Will he? The Alpha King who swore never to use this ritual? Who will believe he suddenly changed his mind? No, my dear. We've planned this very carefully. We'll make it look like he did this himself, like he grew tired of an unsuitable mate and chose to eliminate the problem. His reputation will be destroyed, his authority will crumble, and the council will step in to restore order. Really, you're helping us remove 2 obstacles with one elegant solution. The ritual circle was nearly complete. Alara looked at the symbols, at the glowing silver lines, and felt panic rising in her throat. This couldn't be happening. She couldn't lose 5 years of her life, 5 years of work and growth and the slow, painful process of becoming someone who mattered. She thought of her research, carefully compiled and cross-referenced, now backed up, and distributed, so it couldn't be destroyed. She thought of the Omegas she'd spoken with, who had thanked her with tears in their eyes for finally seeing them. She thought of Theron, who had stood beside her even when it cost him politically, who had offered her resources with no strings attached, who had looked at her like she was extraordinary. She couldn't forget, couldn't let them erase the person she'd fought so hard to become, but she also couldn't escape. The council members were far. Stronger than her, the room had only one exit, and they stood between her and freedom, and even if she screamed, no one would hear her this deep in the catacombs. She was trapped, and in moments they were going to steal her mind and leave her an empty shell. The ritual was ready. Matthias gestured, and the other council members moved toward her. Alara fought. Of course she fought. But they subdued her easily and forced her into the center of the circle. The silver lines began to glow brighter, and she could feel something pulling at her mind, reaching for her memories like cold fingers. Please, she heard herself say, hating the desperation in her voice. Please don't do this. Those memories are mine. That work is mine. You can't just take them. Watch us, Matthias said, and began chanting in the old language. The pull on her mind intensified, and Alara felt her recent memories beginning to blur. The summit, presenting her evidence, the look on Theron's face when she'd agreed to let him protect her. It was all starting to fade, like a dream upon waking. She tried to hold on, tried to cement the memories through sheer force of will, but the ritual was too powerful. She was losing herself, piece by piece, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The last thing she remembered clearly was Theron's voice, his promise. I swear I will never violate your mind or your memories. And then everything went dark, and Alara forgot she'd ever known an Alpha King who looked at her like she mattered. She woke up in a small room with no memory of how she'd gotten there. The last thing she clearly remembered was working in the library at Blood Moon Pack, researching Omega illness patterns, frustrated that she couldn't get access to better equipment. But that had been, how long ago? Days? Weeks? She sat up slowly, her head pounding, and tried to piece together what had happened. There were gaps in her memory, strange blank spaces where time should be, but wasn't. She remembered requesting better laboratory equipment, remembered being frustrated when the pack wouldn't provide it, and then nothing, just a confusing blur of images that didn't quite connect. A man with gray eyes that shifted to gold, equipment arriving that she couldn't have afforded, months of intensive research, evidence of something terrible, but the details slipped away when she tried to focus on them, leaving only the vague sense that she'd forgotten something important. A woman came in, older, with the bearing of a pack doctor. You're awake. Good. How are you feeling? Alara tried to stand and found her legs wouldn't quite support her. Confused. Where am I? What happened? The doctor helped her back to the bed with professional efficiency. You collapsed in your pack's library. Omega weakness, exacerbated by stress and overwork. We've brought you to a facility where you can rest and recover. It made sense. It was exactly the kind of thing that happened to weak Omegas like her, but something about it felt wrong, like a story that was missing crucial pieces. How long have I been here? She asked. 3 days. You've been mostly unconscious, which is normal for Omega collapse. The doctor pulled out a bottle of supplements. "You'll need to take these daily. They'll help stabilize your system." Alara looked at the supplements and felt a wave of irrational fear. "No," she heard herself say. "No, I don't want those." The doctor frowned. "They're necessary for your recovery. All omegas take them." "I don't care. I'm not taking them." Alara couldn't explain the fear, couldn't justify it with logic or reason, but something deep in her hindbrain was screaming danger. The doctor exchanged a look with someone Alara couldn't see, then sighed. "Very well. We can discuss it later when you're feeling more yourself." She left, and Alara was alone with her fractured memories and the growing certainty that something was terribly, catastrophically wrong. Over the following days, the memory gaps became more obvious. She would start thinking about something, reach for a memory, and find nothing there. It was like having holes in her mind, blank spaces where experiences should be but weren't. The facility staff told her this was normal for omega weakness, that her mind was protecting itself from traumatic stress by forgetting. But Alara had spent her whole life studying biology and medicine, and this didn't feel like normal memory loss. This felt deliberate, surgical, like someone had gone into her mind and carefully removed specific pieces. She started testing herself, trying to figure out what was missing. She remembered her childhood, her early years in the pack, remembered being called broken and defective for not being able to shift, remembered discovering her love of science, of research, of seeking truth through observation and analysis. But there was a gap, a significant one, sometime in the recent past. Months, maybe longer, that were just gone. And there was something else, a feeling of loss that she couldn't explain, a sense that someone important was missing, that she'd had something precious and it had been taken away. She found herself looking for someone without knowing who, found herself waiting for something without knowing what. It was maddening, this certainty that she'd forgotten someone crucial, but having no way to remember who or why they mattered. The facility was comfortable enough, but Alara realized after a week that she was essentially a prisoner. The doors were locked from the outside. She wasn't allowed visitors. Her requests to contact her pack were denied. When she demanded to leave, she was told it wasn't safe yet, that she needed more time to recover. But recover from what? Omega weakness? Or something else entirely? She started exploring her room more carefully, looking for clues. Found strange marks on her wrists like she'd been restrained. Found a small scar on her temple that the doctors claimed was from her collapse, but that didn't match any injury that would come from falling. Found a piece of paper shoved deep in her pocket, crumpled and written in her own handwriting. Just 3 words. Don't trust them. She didn't remember writing it, didn't remember what had prompted the warning. But seeing her own handwriting, her own warning to herself, confirmed what she'd suspected. Something had been done to her. Something that required her future self to warn her. Past self not to trust the people claiming to help her. She needed to escape. Needed to figure out what had happened to her and why months of her life were missing. Needed to find whoever it was she couldn't stop feeling the loss of. The opportunity came during a full moon. The facility staff were distracted, dealing with wolves who were struggling not to shift, and Alara used the chaos to slip out of her room. She made it to the outer grounds before alarms started blaring, before she heard pursuit behind her. She ran, her lungs burning, her legs shaking from weeks of inactivity, toward the tree line and whatever freedom lay beyond. She almost made it, was within meters of the forest when someone tackled her from behind, driving her to the ground. She fought, screaming and clawing, but her attacker was far stronger. "Sedate her," someone ordered, and Alara felt the sharp prick of a needle in her arm. The world started going fuzzy, consciousness slipping away despite her desperate attempts to hold on. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the full moon, huge and silver in the night sky. And for just a moment, just a heartbeat, she remembered a man with gray eyes and a promise he'd broken. She woke up strapped to a bed, and this time, there was no pretense of recovery care. Elder Matthias stood over her, looking annoyed. "You're remarkably resistant to the memory erasure," he said, as if this was a mild inconvenience rather than attempted brain violation. Most subjects lose their memories completely and never question the gaps. But you keep trying to remember, keep looking for what's missing. It's admirable, in a frustrating sort of way. Alara's mind was screaming, pieces of memory trying to surface through whatever they'd done to her. "You erased my memories," she said, and felt sick certainty settling in her stomach. "The ritual, the silver circle. You made me forget." Matthias nodded. "We did. And we'll do it again, as many times as necessary, until the memories finally stay buried. The full moon seems to weaken the ritual's hold, allows fragments to surface. We'll have to keep you sedated during moon phases. A small inconvenience." He moved closer, and Alara tried to shrink away, but the restraints held her firm. "You were such trouble, little Omega. All that research, all those accusations. You should have stayed in your library, accepted your limitations. Instead, you had to go digging for truth, had to make yourself a problem." His hand came up to touch her face, and she jerked her head away. "But don't worry. We'll keep erasing those troublesome memories until there's nothing left but the broken Omega you were always meant to be. Someone will notice," Alara said desperately. "Someone will realize I'm missing, will look for me." Matthias laughed. "Who? Your pack? They think you ran away, couldn't handle the pressure of your delusions. The Alpha King?" His expression turned cruel. "He doesn't remember you. Exist. The ritual erased you from his mind just as thoroughly as it erased him from yours. You're no one, little Omega. And no one is coming to save you." The sedatives were taking hold again, pulling her under. Alara fought to stay conscious, fought to hold on to the fragments of memory that had surfaced. A laboratory filled with sophisticated equipment, evidence of systematic murder, a summit where she'd stood before hundreds and told truth to power, and a man, an alpha, who had looked at her, like she was worth more than her Omega status. She tried to hold on to that image, that feeling of being seen and valued, but the drugs and the ritual's lingering effect were too strong, and she slipped back into dark oblivion with one thought repeating, Theron. His name was Theron, and he'd promised never to violate her mind, and somehow, impossibly, he had broken that promise and left her here to fade away. Make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will determine whether Alara's mind can survive long enough for the truth to surface, and whether an Alpha King can remember what he forced himself to forget. Theron stood in his private office, staring at paperwork that refused to make sense, and tried to ignore the growing void in his chest that felt like something crucial was missing. It had been 6 weeks since the summit, 6 weeks since the formal investigation into council corruption had begun, and he should have been focused on the political fallout and the systematic restructuring of Omega healthcare across all territories. Instead, he found himself distracted by a sense of loss he couldn't explain, looking for someone without knowing who, feeling incomplete in a way that had nothing to do with pack responsibilities or political pressure. His beta, Marcus, had suggested it was just stress from the investigation. The council's corruption had run deep, and rooting it out was proving more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Several elder council members had disappeared rather than face justice, including Matthias, who had somehow escaped during the initial arrests. It made sense that Theron would be unsettled, dealing with enemies who had gone underground and might strike at any moment. But this feeling wasn't about stress or politics. This felt personal, like he'd lost someone important and couldn't remember who they were or why they mattered. He found himself checking the guest quarters for no reason, expecting to find someone there. Found himself ordering double portions at meals without knowing why. Found himself waking from dreams of laboratory equipment and brilliant minds and fierce independence, only to have the details slip away when he tried to focus. It was maddening, this certainty that he'd forgotten something crucial, but having no way to remember what. His pack doctor had examined him thoroughly, found nothing wrong physically or mentally. His beta had reminded him that the investigation was taking a toll on everyone. His mother had suggested he needed rest, maybe a vacation from the endless political maneuvering. But Theron knew this wasn't exhaustion or stress. Something had been taken from him, and he needed to figure out what. He was reviewing supply chain documents from the investigation, tracing how the council had distributed poisoned supplements across multiple packs, when he noticed something odd. There were references throughout the paperwork to someone called the researcher, or the Omega scientist, who had apparently uncovered the evidence of council corruption. But nowhere in any official documentation could he find a name or pack affiliation or any identifying information about this person. It was as if someone had gone through and carefully removed every specific reference to the individual who had made the investigation possible. Theron pulled out his private notes from the summit, his own handwriting documenting the presentation of evidence that had exposed the council's crimes. His notes mentioned compelling scientific analysis and undeniable proof, but nothing about who had provided that analysis or compiled that proof. There were gaps in his own memories of the summit, blank spaces where someone should be but wasn't. He called in his beta, showed him the documentation gaps. "Do you remember who presented the evidence at the summit? The Omega scientist who discovered the poisoning?" Marcus frowned, thinking hard. There was someone. I remember being impressed by the presentation, by the thoroughness of the research. But I can't picture them. Can't remember their name or what pack they were from. That's strange, isn't it? It wasn't just strange. It was impossible. Major events like the summit were documented thoroughly, with multiple witnesses and official records. You didn't just lose track of a key participant, especially one who had provided evidence crucial to exposing massive corruption. Unless someone had deliberately made people forget. Unless someone had used a ritual that Theron himself had researched and sworn never to use. He went to the palace archives, pulled the restricted books on memory erasure rituals, read again through the warnings about unintended consequences, about how the ritual didn't just affect the target, but could blur memories and everyone connected to them. Read about how the erasure was most effective when the target was isolated, when all references to them were removed from official records, when everyone they'd interacted with forgot they existed. And he read about how the ritual had a weakness. It couldn't completely erase emotional connections, especially strong ones like mate bonds. Even after memories were gone, the feeling of loss remained. People would search for something without knowing what they were looking for, would feel incomplete without understanding why. Theron sat in the archives as dawn light crept through the windows and felt pieces clicking into place like a puzzle. He hadn't known he was solving. He'd been looking for someone because someone was missing. Someone important. Someone crucial. Someone who had done something extraordinary. The investigation into council corruption hadn't started because of political pressure or routine examination. It had started because someone had provided evidence, had spent years researching and proving what everyone else had dismissed, and that someone had been deliberately erased, removed from memory and record so thoroughly that even the Alpha King couldn't remember them. But why? Why would the council risk using such a dangerous ritual? Why make someone forget rather than simply killing them? He found his answer in a footnote about ritual limitations. The memory erasure required the target to be alive for the effect to be permanent. If the target died, their memories would begin to return to anyone who had known them, would surface in dreams and fragments until the full truth was restored. By keeping the target alive but forgotten, the council could ensure their crimes stayed buried, which meant whoever had exposed them was still alive somewhere, being held prisoner, probably sedated or magically suppressed to prevent the memories from breaking through. And Theron, who had sworn never to use or tolerate the use of memory manipulation, had somehow forgotten someone crucial and let them disappear. He had to find them, had to find this forgotten Omega scientist who had changed everything. But how did you search for someone when you couldn't remember what they looked like, what their name was, or even what pack they'd come from? Theron started with the laboratory. There was a fully equipped research facility in the palace that he'd set up for someone. He couldn't remember who or why, but the space existed, and someone had been using it. The lab was still full of research materials, blood samples carefully labeled, notebooks filled with observations and analysis in handwriting that felt familiar even though he couldn't place it. He read through the notebooks, piecing together years of dedicated work to uncover the truth about Omega poisoning. The researcher had been brilliant, methodical, able to see patterns that others missed. And in the margins of the notebooks, there were small personal notes, reminders about meetings with the Alpha King, comments about how strange it was to work with someone who actually listened, small, careful admissions of growing trust, and maybe something more. This was his mate. Theron knew it with sudden absolute certainty. The person he couldn't remember was the mate he'd been searching for, the one who had rejected the bond but slowly, carefully begun to accept him, the one he'd sworn to protect and support and never manipulate. And somehow, despite his promises, she had been erased from his memory and left defenseless against the Council's revenge. The rage that swept through him was cold and absolute. He'd failed her. Failed to protect her from the very violation he'd sworn to prevent. Whether he'd been magically compelled or simply too weak to resist, the result was the same. His mate was missing, possibly in terrible danger, and he couldn't even remember her name. But he would find her, would tear apart every council holding, would question every elder, would search until he found her, and then he would spend the rest of his life making this right. He started with the patient records from the palace medical wing, looking for anyone who had been admitted around the time his memories got fuzzy. Found a notation about an Omega in the private recovery ward, being treated for stress-induced collapse. But when he went to check on the patient, the room was empty. The Omega had been transferred to a council-approved facility for extended care. The facility was in the remote northern mountains, far from any major pack territory, a place where someone could be held indefinitely without anyone asking questions. Theron assembled his most trusted warriors within the hour, told them they were going to raid a council facility, that they might face resistance, that anyone who wanted to opt out could do so without judgment. Every single wolf volunteered. Whatever the Alpha King had forgotten, they knew him well enough to trust that if he said someone needed rescuing, someone needed rescuing. They traveled through the night, wolves running in formation through dark forest, moving with the coordinated efficiency of warriors who had trained together for years. The facility appeared suddenly out of mountain mist, a stark building surrounded by walls and guards. Theron could see the magical wards glowing faintly, designed to contain someone inside, designed to keep his mate prisoner. The attack was swift and brutal. Theron's warriors overwhelmed the guards with barely any resistance. Most of the facility staff surrendered immediately once they realized they were facing the Alpha King himself. But when Theron reached the central holding area, he found it empty, except for lingering traces of sedatives and magic. They'd moved her, had known he was coming somehow, and relocated their prisoner, but they'd left evidence behind. And Theron gathered every scrap. Medical records detailing repeated memory suppression treatments, notations about subject resistance to standard erasure protocols, and a name, written once in a doctor's careless hand. Ilara. Ilara. His mate's name was Ilara, and saying it out loud felt like finding something precious he'd lost. Fragments of memory began to surface, still hazy but gaining detail. A woman surrounded by research papers, her expression fierce with concentration. The same woman standing before the summit hall, presenting evidence with brilliant clarity. Her voice saying, "I'm not ready for the mate bond," and him saying, "I'll wait as long as you need." The memories were returning, slow and painful, and with them came crushing guilt. He'd let this happen, had let his mate be erased and imprisoned while he fumbled through weeks with no idea what he'd lost. The medical records indicated she'd been moved to a secondary facility 3 days ago. The doctor's notes mentioned increasing difficulty maintaining the memory suppression, that the subject kept trying to remember, kept fighting the erasure. Good. That was so perfectly Ilara, to refuse to accept even magical compulsion, to fight for her own mind with the same fierce determination she'd brought to everything else. Theron traced the transfer documentation to a facility even more remote, practically on the edge of council-controlled territory. They would move her again soon, he realized, keep shifting her location to stay ahead of pursuit, unless he could get ahead of them, predict where they'd go next. He spent hours studying council holdings, mapping their facilities, trying to think like people desperate to hide their crimes. And then he saw it. A notation in Elder. Matthias's private papers, seized during the initial investigation but not yet fully reviewed. A reference to the Northern Sanctuary, where problematic elements could be permanently contained. A location that didn't appear on any official maps, but that could be triangulated from other references. That's where they'd taken her. The Northern Sanctuary, whatever that was. Probably their final solution for someone they couldn't kill, but couldn't allow to remember. A place designed to hold someone forever, keeping them barely conscious, ensuring their memories never returned to expose the truth. Theron gathered his warriors again, explained what they were facing, that this would be more than a simple rescue. The Council's remaining supporters would defend this location with everything they had, because if Alara's memories returned, if she could testify about what had been done to her, it would destroy any remaining Council credibility completely. This was their last stand, and they would fight to keep their prisoner. His wolves didn't hesitate. She exposed them, his beta said simply. She gave voice to thousands of murdered Omegas. We get her back no matter what it takes. The Northern Sanctuary was hidden behind layers of magical concealment, would have been impossible to find without the reference points from Matthias's papers. It was built into a mountain, more prison than facility, designed to be impregnable. Theron looked at the wards, at the defensive positions, at the sheer cliff faces that made approach nearly impossible, and started planning. He had perhaps the best tactical warriors in the territories. They'd find a way in. The assault took 3 days of careful positioning, magical countermeasures, and coordinated strikes against the facility's weak points. By the time Theron's warriors breached the inner sanctum, the facility was in chaos. They found Alara in the deepest cell, strapped to a bed, barely conscious from whatever cocktail of drugs and magic they'd been using to keep her suppressed. She was thinner than he remembered, pale and fragile-looking in a way that made rage burn through him. This was what the Council had done to his brilliant, fierce mate. Had reduced her to this shadow, this barely breathing remnant. He cut through the restraints himself, gathered her carefully into his arms. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open without focusing. Please, she whispered, the words slurred with drugs. Please, I just want to remember. Just want to know who I forgot. I know, Theron said, his voice breaking. I know, and I'm going to help you remember everything. I swear it, Alara. I swear I'll fix this. Her eyes focused slightly at the sound of her name, a spark of recognition that faded almost immediately. You, she breathed. I forgot you. Forgot someone important. Was it you? He carried her out of that terrible place, through corridors littered with defeated Council loyalists, into clean mountain air. The moment they cleared the facility's wards, he felt something shift. The magical suppression broke, and memories came flooding back for both of them. Alara first, gasping as weeks of stolen experiences returned. He could see it happening, see awareness and horror and fury transforming her expression. Then his own memories crashed in. Every moment he'd forgotten, every interaction they'd shared, every step of her brilliant research and his growing admiration, and the careful, complicated dance of their relationship. And with the memories came crushing guilt, because he remembered now that he'd researched the ritual, had considered using it when she'd first rejected him, had ultimately sworn never to do so. But the Council had known about his research, had used his own moment of weakness against him, had made it look like he'd broken his promise and erased his unsuitable mate. They'd counted on that destroying his reputation, counted on no one believing he was innocent. I didn't do this, he said urgently, needing her to understand. I know they made it look like I did, but I swear, Alara, I never used that ritual. Never violated your mind. The Council did this, used my own research against us. She looked up at him, and he couldn't read her expression, couldn't tell if she believed him or hated him, or was too overwhelmed to process anything. I know, she said finally quietly. I know you didn't. When the memories came back, I remembered you swearing not to. Remembered believing you. Remembered. She swallowed hard. Remembered starting to feel something that scared me. They brought her back to the palace. back to the laboratory she'd worked in before her abduction. The palace doctors checked her thoroughly, found evidence of repeated chemical sedation, magical suppression, and the lingering effects of the memory ritual. The erasure had been performed multiple times, they realized. Every time Alara had started to remember, every time the magic had begun to fail, the council had reset it, forcing her to forget over and over. The psychological trauma of that kind of repeated violation was hard to quantify. Alara sat in her lab, surrounded by research she'd compiled before the kidnapping, and tried to process what had been done to her. Tried to reconcile the missing weeks, the repeated erasures, the systematic attempt to destroy not just her memories, but her entire sense of self. "I kept trying to remember," she said, kept fighting to hold on to something, and they kept taking it away. How many times, do you think? How many times did I wake up confused, try to piece together what happened, start to remember, only to have it stolen again? Theron wanted to hold her, wanted to offer comfort, but he wasn't sure she'd want that from him. "The medical records indicate at least 7 full erasure attempts," he said quietly. 7 times you fought through the compulsion, and they had to reset it. He moved closer carefully. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't figure it out faster, didn't find you sooner. You shouldn't have had to endure that alone." She was quiet for a long moment, her hands shaking slightly as she touched her research papers. "When the memories came back, when I remembered everything in one overwhelming flood, do you know what hurt the most?" She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Not the imprisonment, not even the repeated mind violation. It was remembering how I'd finally started to trust you, started to let myself feel something, and then thinking you'd betrayed that, thinking you'd used the ritual despite your promises. That's what broke something in me. I would never," Theron said fiercely. "Ilara, I would never violate you that way. The council tried to destroy us both, tried to make you suffer and make me the villain, but I kept my promise. Even when I didn't remember making it, even with the memories gone, I kept looking for you, kept feeling like something crucial was missing." He knelt in front of her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. "And now that I remember, now that I know what they did to you, to us, I will spend the rest of my life making sure nothing like that ever happens again. To you, to any Omega, to anyone." Alara reached out slowly, her hand trembling slightly as she touched his face. "I remember everything now," she said softly. "Remember rejecting you. Remember you respecting that rejection. Remember you giving me resources with no strings. Remember standing at the summit with you beside me. Remember starting to feel something that went beyond biology and into choice." Her thumb traced his cheekbone. "And I remember being terrified of those feelings, of what they meant, of how much power I was giving you over me." She took a shaky breath. "But Theron, having my mind violated, having my memories stolen repeatedly, having my sense of self systematically destroyed, that showed me what real violation looks like. And it made me realize that trusting you, letting you in, choosing to be vulnerable, that wasn't giving you power over me. That was me exercising my own power to choose connection." He turned his head to kiss her palm, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't have to decide anything now," he said. "You've been through something traumatic. You need time to heal, to process, to figure out what you want without any pressure." But Alara was shaking her head. "I know what I want," she said firmly. "I want to finish exposing every council member involved in this. I want to make sure the Omega poisoning is stopped completely, that every pack implements proper health care. I want to continue my research without anyone trying to silence me." She pulled him closer. "And I want you. Not because of some mate bond neither of us chose, not because you're the Alpha King with power and resources, but because you're Theron, who looked at my research with respect, who kept promises even when they cost you, who waited without pressure, who searched for me when I was erased. I choose you, Theron. Consciously, deliberately, with full awareness of what that means." The kiss was gentle at first, careful, both of them aware of how fragile this moment was. Then Alara made a small sound and deepened it, and Theron felt the mate bond flare to life in a way it never had before. Because this time, it wasn't one-sided longing. This time, she was choosing him back, accepting the bond not as destiny, but as decision. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alara laughed shakily. "That's better than chemistry," she admitted. "That's better than any biological explanation I could come up with." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose, unable to stop touching her now that he'd started. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Thank you for giving me a chance, for letting me prove that not all alphas are the same, for choosing me despite every reason not to. Thank you for waiting," she replied. "Thank you for respecting my no, for supporting my work, for coming for me even when you didn't remember why I mattered." She looked around the laboratory, at the evidence of months of dedicated work. "We have work to do. The council isn't going to go down quietly, and there are still Omegas out there who need detoxification treatment and support. But Theron, I think maybe we can do it together this time. I think maybe I'm ready to let someone stand beside me instead of always fighting alone." They spent the following months rebuilding what the council had tried to destroy. Alara's research was published across every pack territory, impossible to suppress or deny. The Omega detoxification program was expanded, with dedicated facilities and trained staff. New laws were passed protecting Omega autonomy and requiring informed consent for all medical treatments. And slowly, painfully, the old power structures began to crumble, replaced by something more equitable. Alara became the public face of the Reformation, the Omega scientist who had exposed systematic murder and survived repeated attempts to silence her. Packs across the territories invited her to speak, to train their medical staff, to help implement better healthcare systems. And everywhere she went, Theron was beside her, not as the dominant alpha protecting his weak Omega, but as the mate who stood with her as an equal. 6 months after her rescue, Alara woke up one morning and realized something had changed. She could feel her wolf, the presence that had been suppressed for so long, finally healing enough to make contact. It was tentative, weak, but undeniably there. She shifted for the first time in her life that afternoon, in the palace gardens with Theron watching. The transformation was awkward, painful, nothing like the smooth shifts that natural-born wolves achieved. Her wolf form was smaller than most, silvery gray with white markings, and she stumbled trying to figure out how legs worked. But she was there. She was real. And Alara could finally access the part of herself that had been stolen by years of poison. Theron shifted beside her, his massive black wolf dwarfing her smaller form, and they ran together through the gardens. It wasn't elegant or coordinated. Alara kept tripping over her own paws, but it was freedom. It was reclamation. It was proof that the Council's poison could be overcome, that Omegas weren't inherently weak, that given proper care and time, they could be just as strong as any other wolf. When they shifted back, both slightly tangled in their own clothes, Alara was laughing and crying at the same time. "I did it," she said breathlessly. "I actually shifted. I'm not broken anymore. You were never broken," Theron said firmly, pulling her close. "You were poisoned, systematically and deliberately, and you survived it. You overcame it. And you did it while simultaneously exposing the people responsible and changing the entire structure of pack healthcare. You're the strongest person I know, Alara, and your wolf just proves what you've always been." He kissed her gently, though I will admit, watching you figure out how paws work was adorable. She swatted him, still smiling. "I'm going to practice until I can outrun you. I look forward to that challenge." He pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers. "I love you, not because you're my mate, not because of any bond or destiny, but because you're you, because you choose truth over comfort, because you fight for others, because you're brilliant and fierce and impossibly stubborn. I love you, Alara. I love you too," she said, and felt the bond settle between them. No longer a source of conflict, but a freely chosen connection, Logic couldn't explain us. Time tried to erase us, but we found each other anyway. And that's more powerful than any force that tried to keep us apart. They stayed there in the gardens as evening fell. Two wolves who had been denied each other by malice and tradition and systematic oppression, but who had found their way back through choice and persistence and trust. The council was broken, the Omegas were healing, and the Alpha King had found his perfect match in the Omega scientist who had taught him that strength came in many forms, and that the most powerful force in their world wasn't dominance or destiny, but the deliberate choice to stand beside someone and say this person, I choose them above all else. If this story of memory, choice, and a love that survived being erased spoke to you, please hit that like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And make sure you're subscribed because there are more stories of supernatural romance, redemption, and relationships that defy every expectation coming your way. Until next time, remember that the most powerful magic isn't the kind that controls others. It's the kind that sets them free to choose.